Dr. Eleanor Voss still keeps a letter in the top drawer of her desk, the paper worn soft as cotton, where her fingers have traced the lines with 1,000 times. She doesn't need to read it anymore. She knows every word by heart. But sometimes, late at night, after the last patient is gone and the quiet of her office settles in like a second skin, she pulls it out. She holds it, not as a reminder of what she did, but of what she almost didn't do. The case is 40 years old now, and there are still academic papers written about it, still debates that flare up in medical ethics forums, still journalists who request interviews she politely declines. They call it the Voss conundrum, a tidy little phrase that contains multitudes. But for Eleanor, it was never a conundrum. It was a little boy with a constellation of freckles across his nose, and a mother whose hands shook as she signed forms. The story begins, as these stories often do, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a quiet accumulation of details that would eventually coalesce into a storm. It was 1983, and Eleanor was 32, a newly minted attending physician in the pediatric intensive care unit of St. Jude's Mercy Hospital in Chicago. She was brilliant, by all accounts. Her residency had been a masterclass in precision and unwavering logic. She had a reputation for being meticulous, for following protocols with a rigor that bordered on the monastic. Her white coat was always starched, her hair always pinned back, her eyes always scanning the charts for the one variable that didn't fit. She believed in the system, in the sanctity of the rules that governed her profession, because she had seen those rules save lives. They were a bulwark against chaos, a language of order in a place where order was the only thing standing between a child and the abyss. Her father had been a steelworker in Gary, Indiana, a man who believed in the dignity of labor and the absolute authority of a signed contract. "The rules are there for a reason, Ellie," he'd tell her, wiping grease from his hand with a rag that was more stained than cloth. "You follow them, you know where you stand. You start making exceptions, and the whole damn thing falls apart." She had carried that lesson with her through medical school, through the sleepless nights of her residency, and into the gleaming, sterile corridors of St. Jude's. She was a rule follower. It was her anchor. The case that would come to define her arrived on a Tuesday, a day that had started with the mundane rhythm of rounds and the clatter of breakfast trays. The patient was a 7-year-old boy named Leo Castellano. He had been brought in by ambulance, a small, still figure strapped to a gurney, his skin the color of old parchment. The diagnosis was unequivocal: acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a particularly aggressive strain that had already burrowed deep into his marrow. The standard protocol, the rule, was clear: begin induction chemotherapy immediately. Aggressive, relentless. It was the only play in the book, the established pathway that offers statistical hope, a percentage point on a graph that the parents cling to like a life raft. Eleanor met Leo that afternoon. He was propped up on a mountain of pillows in the pediatric ICU, looking impossibly small against the industrial white of the hospital sheets. His mother, a woman named Sophia Castellano, sat in a vinyl chair pulled so close to the bed that her knees touched the metal railing. She had the hollowed-out look of a parent who had not slept in weeks, her dark hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, her eyes fixed on her son with an intensity that seemed to hold him in this world by sheer force of will. Leo, however, was not somber. He was drawing. With a chunky crayon clutched in his fist, he was adding a purple sun to a picture of a house with a red door and a green, lopsided dog. When Eleanor entered, he looked up, his eyes a startling, clear blue against the pallor of his face. "Are you the one with the cold hands?" he asked. Eleanor paused, her chart held to her chest. "I'm sorry. The last doctor who came in had cold hands," Leo explained, his voice a little thin but steady. "When he listened to my heart, it was a surprise." She smiled, a genuine one that softened the sharp angles of her professional demeanor. "I'll try to warm him up first." She did, rubbing her hands together as she approached. She listened to his heart, a faint but determined flutter, and as she did, he resumed his drawing, narrating a story about the green dog who could fly, because he'd eaten a radioactive frisbee. There was a resilience in him, a buoyancy that seemed absurdly out of place in a room filled with beeping monitors and the sharp smell of antiseptic. It was, Eleanor thought, almost defiant. She reviewed his chart with his primary oncologist, Dr. Marcus Webb, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper beard and a weary pragmatism in his eyes. "We start the induction protocol tomorrow at 0600, Webb said, tapping the chart. Vincristine, prednisone, the full course. We'll hit it hard. His counts are low, but he's a tough kid. We have to move." Eleanor nodded. The protocol was a protocol. It was a standard of care, the evidence-based pathway. There was no question. And yet, as she walked back to her office that evening, she found her steps slowing. She passed by Leo's room again, pausing at the half-open door. The lights were dimmed. Sophia was reading aloud from a worn copy of The Little Prince, her voice a soft, melodic whisper. Leo was asleep, his small hand resting on his mother's arm. The purple sun and the flying dog were taped to the wall at the foot of his bed, a splash of color in the monochrome room. It was the next morning that the first thread unraveled. Sophia Castellano requested a meeting. Eleanor found her in the small family consultation room, clutching a thick manila folder. Her hands were shaking, just as they would later when she signed forms, but her voice was steady, grounded in a desperate, fierce resolve. "Dr. Voss," Sophia began, her accent a faint echo of a Mediterranean childhood, "I know what the protocol is. I've read it. I've read every paper Dr. Webb gave me, and then I read the ones he didn't give me. I know the statistics. I know what the chemo will do to his body. I know there's a chance it works. But I also know about the alternative." Eleanor's spine stiffened. The alternative. There was always an alternative in the world of desperate parents, and proven therapies, experimental treatments, the whispered promises of clinics in other countries with sunnier climates and looser regulations. Eleanor had seen it before, the way hope could curdle into something dangerous, leading families away from proven medicine into the wilderness of false promises. "Mrs. Castellano," Eleanor said, her voice gentle but firm, "I understand the fear. We all do. But the protocol is our best chance. It's been studied, refined. The alternative treatments you might have read about." "I'm not talking about a clinic in Mexico," Sophia interrupted, her eyes locking onto Eleanor's with an intensity that was almost unsettling. She opened the folder, revealing a collection of academic papers, their corners soft from being handled. "I'm talking about Dr. Hamid Chaudhry's work at the University of Bern, his immunotherapy protocol, the one that uses the patient's own modified T cells. It's not unproven. It's just new, and it's not here." Eleanor felt the air leave the room. She knew the work. It was revolutionary, a frontier that was just beginning to be explored. It involved harvesting a patient's own immune cells, genetically engineering them to recognize and attack cancer cells, and reinfusing them. The early results from Europe were astonishing. Remissions in patients who had been written off as terminal, but it was not approved in the United States. It was not standard of care. It was, in the eyes of the hospital's ethics board and the insurance companies and the legal department, an unlicensed, untested, and therefore unacceptable risk. "The protocol you're proposing," Eleanor said, choosing her word with care, "is not available here. Even if we were to attempt to facilitate a transfer, the logistics, the cost, the fact that it's not FDA approved, the hospital would never allow it. Dr. Webb would never sign off on it." Sophia leaned forward, and Eleanor saw in her eyes not the frantic desperation of a parent grasping at straws, but the cold, clear focus of a warrior assessing a battlefield. "I'm not asking Dr. Webb. I'm asking you. I've read your papers. Dr. Voss, your work on pediatric immunology. You understand this. You're the one who could make the call. You could argue for it. You could bend the rules." The word hung in the air. Bend the rules. For Eleanor Voss, whose entire professional identity was built upon the unyielding structure of protocols, it was like asking a mason to build a cathedral without a plumb line. She shook her head, a reflex born of years of training. "Mrs. Castellano, I can't. It would be a violation of my oath, of the hospital's policies. The standard of care exists for a reason, to protect patients from harm. We have a protocol that, while difficult, gives them a statistically significant chance." Sophia's expression didn't crumble. It hardened. "Statistics," she said, the word like a shard of glass. "You look at my son, Dr. Voss. Do you see a statistic? Do you see a number on a graph? That protocol you want to give him, It will make him vomit until he can't keep water down. It will burn his insides. It will steal his hair, his strength, and possibly his future, all for a percentage point. A percentage point. She stood up, tucking the folder under her arm. The other protocol, Dr. Chaudhry's work. It's not a guarantee. I know that, but it's a different kind of fight. One that might let him keep his own cells, his own body. I'm not asking you to be reckless. I'm asking you to be brave. She left, and Eleanor sat in the silent room for a long time. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. She walked back to her office on autopilot, her mind churning. She pulled up the files on Dr. Chaudhry's work, reading through the studies she had already memorized. The data was promising, more than promising. It was a paradigm shift, but it was a shift that hadn't yet arrived on American soil. To pursue it would mean defying her superior, going against the hospital's legal team, and potentially subjecting herself to censure, even the loss of her license. It would mean becoming a story, a cautionary tale about the arrogance of a young doctor who thought she knew better than the system. For 3 days, the machinery of the hospital moved forward. Leo began the induction chemotherapy. Eleanor watched from a distance as the first bag of vincristine dripped into his floor. She saw the color drain further from his face, saw the first dry heaves rack his small frame. She saw Sophia sitting in that vinyl chair, her hand on Leo's forehead, her lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps in the steady recitation of a story to drown out the sounds of his suffering. On the 3rd day, Leo's fever spiked. His counts plummeted. He developed mucositis, the lining of his mouth and throat sloughing away, leaving him unable to eat, unable to speak, able only to look at his mother with eyes that held a question she couldn't answer. Eleanor stood outside his room that night, watching through the glass. The green flying dog and the purple sun were still taped to the wall, but they seemed to have faded, their colors leached by the harsh clinical light. Sophia was not reading now. She was leaning over her son, her forehead pressed against his, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And Leo, with a hand that trembled, was drawing a shaky heart in the condensation on the window next to his bed. It was in that moment that Eleanor Voss, the rule follower, the daughter of a steel worker who believed in contracts, felt the floor of her certainties give way beneath her. The rules, she realized, were not a bulwark against chaos. They were a map, and maps were useful, vital even, but they were not the territory. The territory was a 7-year-old boy drawing hearts in window condensation, while his mother's hope was being systematically dismantled by the very protocol designed to save him. The territory was the space between what was statistically correct and what was humanly right. She made the call at 2 a.m., not to Dr. Webb, not to the hospital administrator, but to a number in Bern, Switzerland. She woke Dr. Hamid Chaudhry from a deep sleep, her words tumbling out in a rush of explanation, of pleading. To his credit, he listened. He knew the work. He had read her papers. And when she finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "How fast can you get him here?" The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic, clandestine activity. Eleanor knew she could not get official approval. The hospital's legal team would tie it up in red tape until Leo was beyond saving. So she worked in the margins, using personal favors, calling in every chip she had accumulated over a decade of quiet dedication. She contacted a medical transport company, arranged a private ambulance to the airport, secured a Learjet that a former professor's wealthy benefactor was willing to donate. She falsified no records, but she strategically omitted information, routing her requests through channels that would not trigger automatic reviews. She was no longer a rule follower. She was a rule navigator, threading a needle between what was prescribed and what was necessary. She presented the plan to Sophia the next afternoon, in the same consultation room where it had all begun. Sophia listened, her expression unreadable. When Eleanor finished, outlining the risks, the travel, the experimental nature of the treatment, the certainty of her own professional repercussions, Sophia simply reached across the table and took her hand. "You're going to lose your job," Sophia said, not a question. "Probably," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why?" Sophia asked, her eyes searching Eleanor's face. "Why would you do this? For us?" Eleanor thought about her father, about his creed of rules and contracts. She thought about the gleaming corridors of St. Jude's, the prestige, the career she had built with such painstaking care. And then she thought about Leo's freckles and the flying dog and the heart drawn in condensation. Because, she said, the protocol wasn't working, and I couldn't just watch. I took an oath. It didn't say, follow the protocol. It said, do no harm. And I realized sometimes the greatest harm is in not trying. The escape from the hospital was orchestrated with a quiet efficiency that would have impressed a spy novel. At 4 a.m., under the guise of a transfer to the radiology department for an emergency scan, Eleanor and a sympathetic nurse wheeled Leo's bed to a service elevator, down to a loading dock where the private ambulance waited. Sophia walked beside them, carrying a small bag and the worn copy of The Little Prince. Leo, sedated but conscious, looked up at Eleanor as they loaded him into the ambulance. Are we going on an adventure? He whispered. Yes, Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. The biggest one yet. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. By the time the Learjet touched down in Bern, Dr. Webb had discovered the empty room and raised the alarm. The hospital administration was in an uproar. The ethics committee convened an emergency session. The local news got wind of it, and within hours, the story was national. Doctor abducts terminally ill child in medical kidnapping, read one headline. Rogue physician gambles with young patient's life, read another. Eleanor Voss became a pariah, a symbol of dangerous medical hubris. Her medical license was suspended pending a full hearing. She was branded a maverick, a loose cannon, a threat to the very fabric of institutional medicine. She stayed in Bern, not with Leo's family. She gave them their space, but in a small, Spartan apartment near the university hospital, where she watched from the periphery. She wasn't allowed to participate in Leo's care. That was Dr. Chaudhry's domain. But she was there. She saw the procedure, the harvesting of Leo's T-cells, the genetic engineering in a lab that looked like something from a science fiction film, the rain fusion of the newly modified cells, now programmed to hunt and destroy the leukemia. And she waited. The first week was terrifying. Leo spiked fevers that climbed to 104. His body, flooded with the engineered cells, mounted a cytokine storm that had Dr. Chaudhry pacing the halls. There were moments when Eleanor was sure she had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. She had taken a child away from the only proven treatment, however brutal, and subjected him to an unknown. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, a physical ache that made it hard to breathe. But then, on the 10th day, the fevers began to subside. On the 14th day, a bone marrow biopsy was performed. Eleanor was not in the room when Dr. Chaudhry got the results. She was sitting on a bench in the hospital's courtyard, watching snowfall on the bare branches of a linden tree. She heard footsteps crunching on the fresh snow and looked up to see Dr. Chaudhry, his face unreadable. He sat down beside her without a word, and for a long moment, they just watched the snow. Then, he pulled a paper from his coat pocket. It was a pathology report. He handed it to her. Eleanor looked at the numbers, the dense medical jargon, and then she saw the line at the bottom, the conclusion that made her hands begin to shake. No detectable leukemic cells. Complete molecular remission. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for a month. Dr. Chaudhry placed a hand on her shoulder. You did a reckless thing, he said, his voice kind. But it was also the right thing. Sometimes, that's the only way medicine moves forward, not with protocols, but with people who are willing to be brave. Eleanor returned to the United States 6 months later. Her medical license was reinstated after a probationary period, the controversy surrounding her case having sparked a national conversation about patient autonomy, compassionate use, and the rigid structures of medical bureaucracy. The Voss conundrum became a staple of medical ethics classes, a case study in the tension between following the rules and following one's conscience. She never returned to St. Jude's. Instead, she took a position at a small community clinic in an underserved neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, where the stakes were no less high, but the battles were quieter. Leo Castellano lived. He grew. The green flying dog was replaced by comic books, then by college textbooks. He became an immunologist of all things, working on the very T-cell therapies that had saved his life. He and Eleanor stayed in touch, exchanging letters and, later, emails. He sent her a photograph from his medical school graduation, a young man with a constellation of freckles across his nose and a smile that was pure, defiant joy. The case is still debated. Medical journals publish retrospectives. Bioethicists argue about whether Eleanor's actions were heroic or reckless. Law professors use it to teach the limits of institutional authority. But Eleanor doesn't engage in the debate anymore. She has her answer, and she keeps it in her top drawer. The letter, the one she keeps, is from Leo. He wrote it the day he finished his residency. It's a simple thing, written on a piece of notebook paper, the handwriting a little messy. It says, "Dr. Voss, I remember the purple sun and the flying dog. I remember your warm hands. And I remember the adventure. Thank you for not following the map. You showed me that the rules are there to guide us, but they're not there to trap us. The only rule that really matters is the one you taught me. When you see someone in trouble, you don't look at the manual. You just help. I've spent my whole career trying to be as brave as you were that night. I hope I've come close. With love and gratitude." Leo. Eleanor closes the drawer now, her fingers lingering on the worn paper. Outside her window, the city hums with its endless, complicated life. She thinks about her father, about his steelworker's hands, and about the contract he believed in. She knows now that the most important contracts aren't written on paper. They're the ones we make with each other, in the quiet moments when we choose to see the person instead of the protocol. The case will always be controversial. People will always argue about it, and that's okay, because some questions, Eleanor knows, aren't meant to have easy answers. They're meant to force us to ask ourselves what we truly believe, what we would risk, and who we would become if we were brave enough to choose compassion over compliance. She picks up her coffee, now cold, and takes a sip anyway. On the wall of her office, among the certificates and awards she has accumulated over a long career, there is a single framed drawing. It's a house with a red door, a green lopsided dog, and a purple sun. And in the corner, drawn with a chunky crayon by a small, determined hand, is a heart. It's a reminder that in a world of rules and reasons, of controversies and cases, the only thing that ever truly heals is the quiet, stubborn, world-changing power of choosing kindness. And that, Eleanor thinks, is a case she will never stop arguing for.